I didn't believe in Slenderman, not in the way people online did. Not as some faceless thing lurking in forests waiting to hunt you down, because every story made him sound too deliberate, too human in his intentions, like he chose his victims, like he enjoyed it. And that never made sense to me, because the pictures, the old ones, never looked violent. They looked quiet, almost still, like something that wasn't there to chase you, but to be there when something else was already about to happen. I only started thinking about it differently after Daniel died, or at least after the night we thought he did. There were 4 of us that weekend, me, Daniel, Marcus and Elliot, and we'd gone out to a cabin miles away from anything resembling a town, the kind of place where the trees grow too close together and the sky disappears before evening even properly begins, and Daniel had been acting strange all day, quieter than usual, like he was listening to something none of us could hear, and when I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "Do you ever feel like something's already decided?" I laughed it off at the time, told him he sounded like he hadn't slept in a week, but he didn't laugh back. He just kept looking at the tree line like he was expecting someone to step out of it. It started getting dark earlier than it should have, or at least it felt that way, like the light was draining faster than normal, and by the time we lit the small fire outside the cabin, the woods had already turned into a solid wall of black. No depth, no movement, just darkness pressed up against us. And that's when Elliot pointed it out, just casually at first. Like he wasn't even sure what he was seeing. He said, "There's someone out there." And we all turned, expecting maybe a hiker or some local, but what we saw didn't move, didn't react, didn't even seem affected by the fact that we were staring directly at it. It was tall, too tall to be normal, standing between the trees like it had always been part of them, dressed in something dark that blended too well with the night, except for the face, or where the face should have been, because even from that distance you could tell something was missing, like your eyes kept trying to focus on it but couldn't find anything to settle on. Marcus was the first to speak, saying it was probably just a trick of the light, but his voice had that edge to it, the kind people get when they're trying to convince themselves more than anyone else, and Daniel didn't say anything at all. He just stood up slowly, like he already knew it was there, like he'd been waiting for it. "Don't," I told him, but he took a step forward anyway, not toward it exactly, but not away either, like something was pulling him into alignment with it. And that's when I noticed something I still can't explain properly. The figure hadn't moved, not even slightly, and yet it felt closer, not physically, not in a way you could measure, but in the way a thought gets louder in your head without anyone saying a word. "Do you see it?" Daniel asked quietly, and there was no fear in his voice, none at all, just recognition, like you'd speak to someone you'd met before but couldn't quite place, and Elliot muttered something under his breath, stepped back toward the cabin, but I couldn't move, because something about the scene felt wrong in a way that didn't trigger panic. It triggered understanding, like walking into a room and realizing a conversation has already ended before you got there. The fire cracked behind us, and for a second, the light shifted, just enough to make the trees flicker, and in that flicker, the figure seemed to stretch, not like it was growing, but like it was unfolding into the space between things. And then Daniel smiled, just slightly, the same kind of small, quiet smile you give when something finally makes sense. "It's not here for you," he said, almost gently. And before I could ask what he meant, he took another step forward, and that's when everything went silent. Not quiet, silent, like the world had been muted completely, like even the air had stopped existing between us, and I realized with this strange sinking certainty that whatever that thing was, it hadn't come to take him. It had come because it was already time. We didn't follow him at first, and I think that's the part that bothers me the most, not the thing in the trees, not the silence, not even what happened after, but the fact that for a few seconds, maybe longer, we just stood there and watched Daniel walk away like it was something ordinary. Like people just get up and leave conversations in the middle of the night and no one questions it. And even when the silence lifted and the sounds came rushing back all at once, the crackling fire, the wind pushing through the branches, Elliot's sharp breath beside me, none of us moved immediately, because something in that moment told us, without words, that this wasn't something you interrupted. "Daniel, wait," Marcus finally called out, his voice louder than it needed to be, like he was trying to break something invisible. But Daniel didn't turn, didn't slow down, didn't even hesitate. He just kept walking toward the trees, toward that thing. and the distance between them didn't seem to close in any normal way. It just disappeared, like perspective itself was folding in on them. "We should go after him," Elliot said, but he didn't sound convinced, and I realised I wasn't either, because the closer Daniel got, the less it felt like he was approaching something dangerous, and more like he was reaching something inevitable. Then he stopped, just a few feet from the edge of the tree line, close enough that the darkness began to swallow the outline of his body, and for a second, I thought maybe he'd snap out of it. Maybe he'd turn around and laugh and call it a stupid prank, but instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was listening again, like whatever he had been hearing all day had finally become clear. And then he stepped forward. Not into the trees, not really, but into something that made the trees irrelevant, because the moment he crossed that invisible line, the darkness seemed to take him in without resistance. No sound, no struggle, no sudden movement, just absence, like he'd been edited out of the world mid-frame. "No," Elliot whispered, and that was enough to break whatever hold the moment had on us, because suddenly we were moving, all three of us at once, running towards the spot where Daniel had been standing just seconds ago, calling his name, crashing through branches and uneven ground. But when we reached the tree line, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had passed through, just the same dense wall of trees, untouched, unmoved, like we'd imagined the entire thing. Marcus pushed deeper first, forcing his way between the trunks, and we followed, not because we thought we'd find him immediately, but because not following felt worse, like accepting something we weren't ready to accept, and the deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. Not in an obvious way, not in a way you could point to, but in small accumulating details, the spacing between trees that didn't match what we'd seen from outside, the way the ground felt too even in some places, and too uneven in others, like the forest wasn't built to be walked through, only looked at from a distance. "Daniel!" Marcus shouted again, and this time the sound didn't travel properly. It seemed to drop after a few feet swallowed whole, and that's when Elliot grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Don't," he said, his voice low, urgent, and I followed his gaze. It was there again, not behind us this time, not ahead either, but everywhere between, like no matter where you focused, you could find it standing at the edge of your vision, tall, still, unchanged, and yet closer than it had any right to be. "We need to go back," Elliot said, and for once, no one argued, because the deeper we went, the more it felt like we weren't just moving through the forest, we were moving into something that had already been decided long before we arrived. The walk back didn't take as long as it should have, which didn't make sense because we'd run in a straight line for several minutes, but somehow the cabin lights were visible almost immediately, like we'd never gone that far at all, and when we stepped out of the tree line, the fire was still burning exactly the same way we'd left it, as if no time had passed. None of us spoke for a while, not because we didn't have questions, but because every question felt pointless in the face of what we'd just seen, and eventually Marcus said the only thing that felt remotely solid, "We call someone in the morning." Elliot nodded. I didn't say anything because I couldn't stop thinking about the way Daniel had smiled, not afraid, not confused, just certain. That night, none of us slept properly. We stayed inside the cabin, lights on, every window covered, like that would make a difference, like something that could stand in the dark without being seen would care about a thin layer of glass. And sometime around 3 a.m, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first, not loud, not sharp, just present, like a low distortion in the air itself, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Elliot sitting upright on the bed across from mine, staring at the window. "You hear that?" he whispered, and I nodded, even though I didn't want to, because acknowledging it made it real, and slowly, without either of us saying it out loud, we both understood the same thing at the same time. It wasn't outside, it was closer. And then Elliot said something I wish he hadn't. "If it took Daniel because it was his time," he said, his voice barely holding together, "then why is it still here?" Elliot's question didn't leave the room after he said it. It stayed there, hanging between us like something physical, something that couldn't be ignored once it existed, and neither of us answered, because we both already knew the only answers were the ones we didn't want to say out loud. So we just sat there in that dim artificial light, listening to that low distortion in the air, that almost sound that felt like it was pressing against the inside of our heads rather than coming from anywhere in the room. Marcus was still asleep, or at least he looked like it, lying on his side with his back toward us, completely still in a way that didn't feel natural, and for a moment I considered waking him, just to break the feeling, just to prove that things were still normal in some small way. But before I could move, Elliot spoke again, softer this time, like he was afraid something else might hear him. "What if it doesn't leave?" he said, "until it's done." I didn't respond because something about that felt right in a way that made my chest tighten, like a truth you recognize before you understand it. And that's when Marcus sat up. Not suddenly, not like someone waking from a nightmare, but slowly, deliberately, like he'd been awake for a while and had just decided to move. "You're both wrong," he said, his voice calm. Too calm, and Elliot and I both turned to him at the same time. "About what?" Elliot asked, already sounding like he didn't want to hear the answer. Marcus didn't look at us immediately. He just kept staring at the wall in front of him, like he was watching something we couldn't see. "It doesn't stay," he said. "It just doesn't leave when you think it should." There was something off about the way he spoke. Not in the words themselves, but in how certain he sounded. Like he wasn't guessing, like he knew, and that's when I noticed the window behind him. The curtain had shifted slightly, just enough to leave a thin gap where the outside could be seen, and through that gap, there was nothing at first, just darkness, until my eyes adjusted, and then I saw it. Standing just beyond the glass, closer than it had ever been, perfectly still, watching, or at least present. My breath caught, but I didn't say anything because saying it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for, and somehow I knew Marcus already knew it was there. "You saw it first, didn't you?" I asked quietly. Marcus finally turned to look at me, and there it was again, that same small quiet smile Daniel had given earlier. Not happy, not relieved, just understanding. "Not today," he said. Elliot shook his head immediately. No, don't start that," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't some kind of pattern, this is just whatever this is, it's messing with us, that's all." Marcus didn't argue. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked toward the window, and every instinct in my body told me to stop him, to grab him, to pull him back, but I didn't move, because deep down I already knew it wouldn't matter. He stopped just short of the glass and looked out at the figure, and for a moment, nothing happened. Just the two of them existing in the same space, separated by something as fragile as a window. And then Marcus spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for us to hear. "It's not here to take us," he said, echoing Daniel's words from earlier. "It's here because we're already going." Elliot let out a shaky laugh. "Going where?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a real question. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He just kept looking at it, like he was listening again, like Daniel had been, and then he said, "It doesn't decide, it just arrives when the decision's already been made." The room felt smaller after that, like the walls had shifted closer without moving, and that low distortion in the air grew slightly stronger, just enough to notice, like something aligning into place. "Marcus, step away from the window," I said, finally finding my voice, but he didn't move. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked instead, still staring outside. Neither of us answered. "It's not death," he said. "It's knowing exactly when it becomes real." And then the sound changed. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer, like something had tuned itself properly for the first time, and Marcus reached for the handle. Elliot moved then, fast, grabbing his arm. "No," he said, almost pleading now. "Don't open it." Marcus looked down at Elliot's hand, then back at him, and for a second something human flickered there, something uncertain. But it passed quickly. "You can't stop something that's already happened," he said gently. And before either of us could react, he pulled his arm free and unlocked the window. The moment it opened, the air in the room shifted. Not a gust, not a breeze, just a subtle change, like the boundary between inside and outside had stopped existing, and Marcus stepped back. Not forward, just enough to clear the space, like he was making room for something. For a long second, nothing happened. And then, without a sound, without movement, without crossing the space in any way we could understand, it was inside. Not walking, not entering, just there, occupying the space it hadn't occupied before. Elliot stumbled back, hitting the wall, his breath coming fast now, panicked. But I couldn't move, because up close it was worse, in a way that didn't rely on anything visible. Its form was wrong in ways your mind couldn't process fully. Like looking at something that refused to be understood, and where a face should have been, there was nothing. Not blankness, not smoothness, just absence. like the idea of a face had been removed entirely. Marcus didn't react. Dios. He just stood there, calm, almost peaceful. And for a moment I thought, maybe this was it. Maybe he would just disappear like Daniel had, quietly, without struggle. But that's not what happened. Instead, Marcus turned his head slightly and looked at me. "It's not me," he said. The words didn't make sense at first. "What?" I asked, my voice barely there. And then slowly, impossibly, the figure shifted. Not by moving, not by stepping, but by becoming aligned with something else in the room, with me. And in that moment, everything clicked into the place with a clarity that made my stomach drop. Every strange feeling, every wrong detail, every second of understanding I hadn't wanted to accept. It hadn't stayed for Daniels. It hadn't stayed for Marcus. It had stayed because it had never come for them at all. Marcus's expression changed then, not to fear, but to something like sympathy, which somehow felt worse. "You just saw it first," he said quietly. And for the first time since this began, I understood what Daniel had felt in that moment by the trees. That strange, calm recognition, that quiet certainty that something had already been decided, long before you became aware of it. And I realized the truth that none of us had wanted to face. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't choose you. It doesn't even see you the way we understand seeing. It simply arrives when it's already time.